Okay. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this, Rebecca, and organizing this. I think these kind of events are great, and it's always good to get public engagement, especially around controversial issues like this. So my job today is to kind of set the stage for everyone and give you a little bit of basics and primers about cannabis, its effects on the brain, and how it actually is in interacting with the biology of our body. But I think an important thing to start off with is kind of defining. There's a lot of terms in the field that get thrown around, and I think it's just better to set the stage quickly to make sure everyone's on the same page with this. So the cannabinoids that most people are familiar with are exogenous cannabinoids, but these actually do come in different flavors as well, and the way that people refer to them can have a lot of implications about how people interpret them. So as a field, we usually refer to any of the cannabinoids that are derived from the cannabis plant as being phytocannabinoids. So this is things like THC, which is the psychoactive constituent of cannabis, as well as cannabidiol, or CBD, which a lot of people are familiar with because of its media attention, specifically with regards to pediatric epilepsy. But then you have this other aspect of things which are called synthetic cannabinoids, and these have also gotten a lot of attention, mostly negative in the news, and for good reason, I would say, for the most part. Although, again, the term synthetics actually applies to two separate umbrellas of cannabinoids. And the first one is things like nabilone and dronabinol and marinol. So these are actually just synthetic versions of THC that are in a capsule. These are like medical grade pharmaceuticals. These are quite safe, but they are referred to as synthetics, and they're not to be mistaken with the other class of synthetics, which is the stuff that's basically hit the black market, things like K2 and spice. And these are actually molecules that have been generated in a lab, which are agonists, so they act directly on cannabinoid receptors, but they're not really anything like THC. And the way that our body handles and metabolizes them isn't really well understood, and there seems to have been a lot of case reports of cardiotoxicity and randomness. I was actually completely baffled why anyone would ever use this when there was a relatively century-used drug that had low toxicity, why anyone would switch to this. And apparently it's actually driven by drug tests. A lot of it is people who don't want to fail the drug test find an alternative. So I think when you start talking about policy and how this impacts the public, this is a big thing to consider, is the impact that people are actually using a more dangerous alternative to be able to avoid a drug test. So these are the kind of points I think are important to consider. But I think it is important to understand the distinction between something like nabilone, which is synthetic, versus something like K2, because nabalone's safe and widely used in a medical context, and K2 and spice are not. So what I study is actually endogenous cannabinoids. So this is like, most people know what endorphins are. I'm assuming that people are familiar with that term. Endorphins are your body's own version of morphine. People use terms like endorphin rush all the time. Like if you hurt yourself or something exciting happens, you get an endorphin rush. And this is basically the release of opiates in your own body that they make. So quite similar to that, your body does make its own version of THC. And we call these endocannabinoids. And these molecules signal throughout the brain. They act on receptor targets, which are the same receptor targets that THC acts on, and they're called CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors. So I'm going to kind of go into this very briefly and at a high level just to make sure everyone's familiar with what I mean. But the interesting thing about these is actually, as I'll get into, a lot of what we've learned about what the endocannabinoid system does in the body has been based on what the physiological effects of cannabis are. And so there's a lot of insight we've learned about the natural biology of the brain through cannabis as well. Okay, so the two main cannabinoids, and I'd assume the ones that the majority of the general public are familiar with, are THC, which, as I said, is the psychoactive constituent of cannabis, and the other one is cannabidiol, or CBD. Now, what's interesting is cannabidiol doesn't really seem to exert any psychoactivity. It maybe has a little bit of sedative properties, and yet it's gotten a lot of attention because it has this anti-epileptic properties. It has actually become this kind of mystery in the science world. No one really knows how it works. I'll kind of touch on it a bit towards the end as well, just because it's been this thing that people have studied and everyone's fascinated by it, but no one really knows what it does. And I find it interesting because there's so much push right now on this idea of THC and CBD ratios in cannabis. And the reality actually is there's a surprising paucity of evidence to support the idea that this has a huge impact on a lot of outcomes that aren't just related to the fact that high CBD strains of cannabis tend to be low in THC, because the two molecules, there's a competitive process for their synthesis. So any strain of THC that by nature is high in CBD has to be lower in THC because it can't make as much. And so it's not entirely clear exactly. A lot of the actually pharmacological studies where they give people THC and CBD have been less conclusive about the interaction between these molecules. But it's one of these things that's made it into the mainstream media, and people really are familiar with it. So THC. So THC was really through a lot of work from labs primarily in Israel that were doing extractions of different chemicals out of cannabis in the 60s, it was discovered that THC is the psychoactive constituent. Little known fact, the original publication of the isolation and characterization of THC was on April 20th in 1964. The theory is this is one of the births of the term 420. Everyone seems to have a pet theory of where it came from. I would be very impressed if that somehow had made it into the general public, that this was a publication date, but it was discovered by this guy, Rafi Meshulam, who is at Hebrew University in Israel, and he's actually been a huge mover and shaker in the cannabinoid field. He's been involved in a lot of the instrumental discoveries in the field, and that is actually what he looked like in the 60s. He's in his mid-80s now, and he's still kicking it, comes to a lot of meetings and flies around. He's a very active scientist. But the interesting thing that Rafi stimulated when he discovered THC was this kind of scientific quest people had about how does this work? What is it doing in the body? And there was a lot of speculation, and it took, I would say, almost 3 decades actually for them to actually figure out exactly how it worked in the body. But after a lot of work, people recognized that this wasn't just some kind of random indiscriminate effect, that THC was actually acting through a biological system that existed in the body that seemed to be have receptors that THC specifically bound to. So this was after the discovery of the endorphins and the opiate system. And so people realized that it wasn't just fortuitous that humans discovered cannabis and then somehow your body responded to it. There was actually an endogenous system that our body has that was receptive to molecules like this. And so through a lot of work, mostly that occurred throughout the 90s actually. I mean, in the scientific world, our understanding of cannabinoids is actually pretty young relative to a lot of other neurotransmitter systems and other biological processes in the body. But what we do know now quite definitively is there are kind of 2 classes of cannabinoid receptors. They're called CB1. CB1 is the main receptor in the brain. This is the receptor that mediates all the psychoactivity of THC and cannabis. And it has a wide array of biological processes that it regulates, which I'll touch on, things like feeding and pain and stress. And then the other receptor that was discovered a little bit later is the CB2 receptor. And this, there's debate over whether it actually exists in the brain or not, but it definitively exists at quite high levels in the immune system. And so you have almost the separation of these 2 receptor systems, one in the brain mediating a lot of the behavioral effects, and then one in the immune system that seems to regulate some inflammatory responses. And so we'll kind of go through each of these in a little bit more depth. So without kind of boring you with the scientific details of exactly how cannabinoids are working in the brain, basically the way that the brain works in a very simplistic manner is neurons communicate with each other. And what that means is a neuron releases a transmitter from what we call the presynaptic neuron, and it activates neurons on the other side of this small cleft, which you can kind of see as the gap there. So most neurotransmitters in the brain move in this forward direction. They go from one neuron to the next, and they talk back and forth. And this is how neurons communicate to each other. So what's interesting about cannabinoids is they actually don't go in that direction. They influence the release of neurotransmitters in the brain. So they're really more of a modulator. So what they do is when THC hits cannabinoid receptors throughout the brain, or when endocannabinoids are released, they're not really activating or deactivating neurons in the brain. They're just tweaking the amount of neurotransmitter that's getting released in a specific circuit, which seems to be why they have this more modulatory effect on a lot of behaviors and physiological processes, as opposed to something like alcohol, which alcohol binds directly to inhibitory transmitters and directly quiets down neurons. So there is a little bit of difference in the pharmacology of how cannabinoids actually work throughout the brain. But that's important because this also relates to the fact that the way that the cannabinoid receptors are distributed throughout the brain has a huge impact on the different effects. But one thing that's very important is, I mean, the one area of the brain that really lacks cannabinoid receptors is the part of your brain stem that regulates cardiopulmonary function. And this explains why you can't actually overdose on THC. So this is in contrast to opiate receptors. So there are a huge amount of opiate receptors in the cardiorespiratory centers of your brain. So when they get activated, when someone has too much opiate in their system and they pass out, those centers of the brain actually, the neural activity depresses to a point where the kind of unconscious regulation of heart rate and breathing shuts down and someone stops breathing, their heart stops beating, and then they die. So this is literally impossible with cannabinoids because there just isn't the receptors in that part of the brain. And this is one of the reasons a lot of people have argued over safety issues when you compare things like opiates to cannabinoids, because of the toxicity, the lack thereof toxicity with cannabinoids. Okay, so as I mentioned, one of the things that we've learned about what the endocannabinoid system does in the brain has actually been, I would say, a rather non-creative process, because you just look at what cannabis does to humans, and then you're like, maybe it does that normally. So not surprisingly, when the system was first discovered in the 90s, one of the first things that the scientific community started looking at was this idea that endocannabinoids might actually be a potent regulator of feeding behavior. And this was because one of the most classical effects of people consuming cannabis was them getting like the munchies, or this fact that they want to consume highly palatable foods, and often will eat beyond satiation actually. So you can fill someone up, and then if they go out and consume cannabis, they're like, you know what, I can have 3 more desserts and then keep eating. And so this became quite interesting. And actually what people discovered in the scientific community is that endocannabinoids have a very important role in regulating feeding. And actually what you find is if someone fasts, so if you don't eat for 24 hours and you have that natural drive to want to start eating more and more because your body's kind of freaking out and like, we need calories, we need nutrients to come into the body, part of that mechanism is actually driven by a release of endocannabinoids in feeding circuits. And what they do is they try and drive you, they enhance the rewarding aspects of food, but they also try and drive your approach behavior to eating food. And so the way I always describe it is I say when someone consumes cannabis and their brain gets bathed in THC, what they're doing is they're almost tricking their body into thinking that they've been fasting for 24 hours. Now they need to binge a whole bunch of high-calorie, high-carb-dense foods to try and replace the energy that was depleted over the 24 hours where they weren't consuming food, for example. So that was a very interesting kind of way that someone used an effect of a drug to understand a natural physiological process. And it's neat because what happens is as someone becomes satiated and they eat a lot of food, endocannabinoid levels start to decline. And it's almost like this feeding signal says, okay, we don't need to eat anymore. This can start going down in the brain. And then for the purposes of what I do, I study things like stress and anxiety. And I got into this area because I was fascinated by the fact that, kind of building off what the feeding world had done, thought, well, if you look at the main reason, the kind of survey studies that people have done when they actually ask people who are recreational cannabis users, why do you smoke pot? About 85% of people say the number one reason they do is because at the end of the day, it takes the edge off, it reduces anxiety and helps them relax. And so I thought this was very interesting because this is probably giving us some insight into something that the endocannabinoid system itself is doing in terms of regulating stress responsivity. And through about 15 years of work now, through myself and probably about a dozen other labs around the world, what we've been able to figure out now is actually this seems to be what happens. Similar to the feeding story, what happens is when we get stressed, our brain releases a cloud of endocannabinoids, part of which seems to try and quiet down the parts of our brain that makes us anxious and stressed so that we come back to normal. We always try and use this example where, if you see something that freaks you out, you kind of go into this panic mode and you lock up, and then when you realize you're safe, you're like, and you calm down. One of my colleagues always says, cannabinoids are the They're that part that helps your brain tell you, it's safe now, it's okay, we can calm back down and relax. And they seem to be very important for stress recovery. And so this has been kind of the work that we've done, and I'll make a comment in a second about how this relates to something like post-traumatic stress disorder, because I think this gives us a lot of insight into the biology of how the brain handles stress, and how when something doesn't work properly, you can move into a situation of pathology. And then finally, the other main area that was discovered, again, not surprisingly, when they look at why people had used cannabis for centuries, a lot of it came down to pain. And certainly this seems to be the area that has the strongest body of clinical data that does clearly indicate that there is some medical benefit in the context of chronic pain with cannabis. And not surprisingly, endocannabinoids as well were discovered, like opiates and endorphins, to be natural analgesic molecules. And so when you have a painful stimulus, you burn your hand or you cut yourself, you sense that pain so that you withdraw from the stimulus and therefore you don't damage your body. But then your body doesn't want you to be in chronic pain. So one of the mechanisms is it will release endorphins or endocannabinoids or both. And this helps that pain sensation go back down so you're not constantly suffering after the fact. Okay, so I'll just quickly touch on the anxiety story because this is what's near and dear to my heart. So one of the things that's really interesting, as I mentioned about what we know about endocannabinoids, is that they naturally act to promote recovery from stress. They help calm the brain down after a stressful event to say, it's okay now, we don't need to be freaked out. They seem to be involved in reducing anxiety. There's been a lot of very interesting animal and human work that's actually found this spontaneous gene variant in one of the enzymes that regulates the endocannabinoid system. And so people who have this gene variant don't metabolize cannabinoids as well, and so what they have is their endocannabinoid levels are kind of always high in their body and their brain all the time. And quite interestingly, these people have a more relaxed personality, they have less anxiety, they seem to have better top-down control of their emotional responses to stress. So it's very interesting because that's actually showed us that in humans, the endogenous cannabinoid system is very important for regulating emotional states and anxiety. And we also learned this from a rather disastrous drug trial that happened in the mid-2000s when they were testing the idea that actually blocking cannabinoid receptors could be a really good way to treat obesity. And it effectively was. It was very good at making people who were very obese lose a significant amount of weight. But the consequence was, as they lost all the weight, they also became quite anxious and depressed. So there was kind of a trade-off that went there. It didn't really work. But what that really told us was that the endocannabinoid system is really important for regulating not just feeding behavior and metabolism, but emotional states in humans. And if this system gets disrupted, what seems to happen is an inability to appropriately regulate emotions to the same capacity. So things like anxiety can become overwhelming and predominant in someone's emotional repertoire. And then the other thing that the endocannabinoid system is very important for, and this is relevant for things like PTSD, is the stability of emotional memories. And so always when something emotionally salient happens, these memories become quite strong and indelible in our experience. So we think about them, they're present a lot, and often if something traumatic has happened, these memories can become omnipresent and kind of there a lot of the time and consume people quite significantly. And what we've understood about endocannabinoids is that ability of the natural decay of the memory, the forgetting process, seems to be facilitated by endocannabinoids. And what happens when this system doesn't function properly is those memories just maintain and almost hyper-consolidate and become very significantly present. And people, or in the animal work at least, they see responses to stimuli that used to predict a threat that are now safe, but the animal acts as if this stimulus is still dangerous for them. And this is very similar to what we see in humans in many situations with PTSD, where after a traumatic event has happened, other stimuli that resemble the trauma, but really are not dangerous in any capacity, still trigger responses. And so we've actually come up with this theory. There's a group of us, and I think this has gained a fair amount of traction from a lot of both combined animal and human studies, that actually there may be evidence for something like an endocannabinoid deficit in post-traumatic stress disorder, or that individuals that are on the lower end of the spectrum of natural functioning of their endocannabinoid system may be more vulnerable to developing stress-related pathologies if a traumatic event happens to them, because there seems to be a big separation in who develops PTSD and who does not after a traumatic event. And so this has been a source of a lot of research, people trying to understand what predicts who goes down which trajectory. And so a lot of the evidence that we're looking at, we really think that the endocannabinoid system is an important determinant in this. And so one of the hypotheses that's been put out there is that one of the reasons why cannabis seems to show some efficacy for a lot of people with PTSD is that perhaps what they're doing is normalizing an endogenous deficit in a biological system that normally acts to calm them down. And if it's not working properly, they stay in this hypervigilant, hyper-aroused state. And the introduction of cannabis may actually help to normalize some of these changes and ameliorate some of the symptoms. So that can be a controversial issue. I'm happy to field questions on it, but I just wanted to kind of put that in context of what it is that we know about how endocannabinoids work and what that means for what cannabis is doing. This is just kind of a brief slide to show that cannabinoid receptors are really distributed quite widely throughout the brain. And like I said, you don't see any in the cardiorespiratory centers of the brain, but you do see it in areas that regulate things like learning and memory, and emotional states, and motor control, and feeding behavior, and emesis or nausea. Because one of the other effects that's been quite reliable is that cannabinoids are very potent anti-nauseants, especially for people undergoing chemotherapy. So it's been quite interesting because this is about 25 years of work that's summarized in somewhat of a single slide, showing that people have really mapped out what parts of the brain seem to mediate what effects of cannabinoids. And it's really quite, in my mind, amazing that you have a system that's so widely distributed and has the ability to impact so many physiological systems and functions, and yet it only does everything at kind of a moderate level. It's not like a lot of other drugs which really are sledgehammers, the way that they impact the way that the brain functions in some regards. But the cannabinoid receptors, even CB1, is not just in the brain. It is literally spread throughout the entire body. It's in almost every organ system that we have. So you have cannabinoid receptors in the liver, in your fat tissue, in your pancreas, in your muscle, in your gut, and it seems to do different things everywhere. You have it in your blood vessels. Cannabinoid receptors in your blood vessels promote vasorelaxation, so your blood vessels dilate. So typically what I actually see when someone consumes cannabis is they have a drop in blood pressure because their blood vessels dilate, and then in response to that, you get this tachycardia where the heart starts beating faster to somewhat compensate for the drop in blood pressure. And this has been one of the things that people have tried to look at, and it's one of the contraindications that's become apparent is people who do have cardiac issues. There's some concern that tachycardia or the drop in blood pressure could impact an existing state. And I think this is somewhere where we really need a lot more research done because it's really only been kind of hinted at, but no one really knows entirely. But what you can see from this is that cannabis has the ability, and THC at least especially, to impact a huge array of physiological systems in the body. And there's been some very interesting studies, kind of large-scale population studies that have informed us of things that we actually were quite surprised at. One being, given the fact that cannabis promotes feeding through the munchies, it's been quite surprising to see that on a population level, pot smokers actually have lower rates of obesity, lower rates of type 2 diabetes, and better glucose handling than the general population. This has been replicated in 2 large population studies. And recently, Keith Sharkey, who's also at the Hotchkiss Brain Institute here, has actually replicated this in animals as well and shown the exact same effect. We don't really know how this is happening, but it's quite fascinating, actually, to see that there's this effect on physiology and metabolic function. So it likely has something to do that's outside of the feeding domain. It's something in peripheral metabolism. But there's certainly something going on there that I think is of high interest. But let's not forget about CB2. I would say I'm going to kind of touch on some of the questions I often get, but one of them often relates to the effects of the cannabinoids on the immune system. So the CB2 receptor, like I said, is on immune cells. And what CB2 receptor does is it acts to suppress the release of inflammatory molecules. So this explains, I mean, one of the things that I find the most interesting about medical usage of cannabis is if you actually look at the disease clusters that a lot of people self-medicate for, outside of things like anxiety and insomnia, a lot of them, and pain, a lot of them tend to cluster into a very specific domain of chronic inflammatory diseases like IBS, arthritis, MS, and the common theme underlying a lot of this is that these are diseases associated with a hyperinflammatory state. And what's interesting about the cannabinoid, the CB2 receptor, is that this receptor, because it acts to suppress the release of pro-inflammatory molecules, it might actually have these benefits as an anti-inflammatory approach. But what makes it really interesting is it doesn't do anything to a normally functioning immune system. So this was the concern in the early days when they realized that cannabinoids could affect immune function. The thought was this was going to be a linear relationship. And what I mean by that is no matter where you were, if you consumed cannabis, it would reduce the function of your immune cells. But that actually doesn't seem to be what it does. It doesn't seem to do anything to anyone in a normal state. But if you're in a hyperinflamed state, it seems to have the ability to come back down. And one of the reasons that we've learned that this probably happens is that immune cells at rest, when they're kind of quiet and not being activated, don't seem to express a lot of CB2 receptors. And what happens is when an inflammatory signal happens in the body and those cells get angry and they wake up and start dumping inflammatory molecules everywhere, they also start expressing CB2 receptors. And during that process, it's almost like a feedback signal that allows those cells to be quieted back down. And it makes them much more responsive to different constituents from cannabis as well as endocannabinoids to try and dampen that. So this is a big area right now in therapeutics. From a pharmaceutical perspective, people are really trying to harness CB2 receptors for inflammatory diseases and see if actually a specific CB2 agonist, which shouldn't have any of the psychoactivity associated with THC, has the ability to ameliorate a lot of these inflammatory diseases. So cannabidiol, I'll only touch on this quickly just because it's something that everyone seems to be curious about. No one really knows what it does, and people have been studying this for like 30, 40 years, and no one can really figure out how it works the way it does. My guess is, honestly, it's a very dirty compound, and it probably interacts with a whole bunch of different biological systems, and it has a net effect. And so one of the things that I'll just point out 2 systems that it's been shown to interact with. So you probably don't know what adenosine is, but I can guarantee you that you're familiar with its effects on your body because adenosine is a transmitter signal that is kind of quiets you down. It's kind of like cannabinoids. It helps you relax a bit. This is the system that's disrupted when you consume coffee. So caffeine is kind of like an anti-adenosine. And it's one of the mechanisms by which caffeine kind of drives people and wakes them up, which hopefully everyone had this morning. I know I did. So cannabidiol is almost like the anti-coffee. It seems to do the exact opposite effect of caffeine on the adenosine system. It enhances the actions of adenosine, which probably contributes to the kind of sleep-promoting and somnogenic effects of cannabidiol that people have when they consume it at high doses. And then the other thing it seems to do is there's a fair amount of work that's, I would say, consistently demonstrated it directly interacts with serotonin receptors. And this is believed to be involved in some of the kind of anti-anxiety effects of cannabidiol is its ability to promote serotonin actions at certain receptors that it acts at. And so when I was saying initially about THC, the thought was it was going to be this dirty molecule that interacted with everything. That wasn't true for THC. It turns out we have this whole cannabinoid system, but that is true for cannabidiol. It does seem to be indiscriminate and affect a whole bunch of different systems in the brain. There's more than even just what I've highlighted. I'm just pointing out these two because we have a better idea of what they relate to. And it's interesting because there is, I would say, a fair amount of work in both animals and humans now that has demonstrated that cannabidiol does seem to possess anti-epileptic properties, especially in the context of things like pediatric epilepsy, especially the disease called Dravet syndrome, where there's a lot of attention being focused on right now. Cannabidiol does also seem to be anti-inflammatory as well, and it seems to also possess anti-anxiety properties. So again, there is some therapeutic potential from here, and I think this idea, I think with research actually moving in a direction of looking at strains and looking at relative THC to CBD concentrations, we actually will have information as to whether this is a bona fide effect or if this is a lot of hype. Because I'd say at this point in time, it's very hard to make firm conclusions either way. Okay, so I'm just going to try and end now by addressing a couple of things that I often get asked and what we try and understand. So what do we know about how cannabis affects the brain? So there are two ways that the scientific community has gone about studying this. So the first one is largely human epidemiological studies. And what this is studying cohorts of people over time that have smoked pot, or doing what a lot of them are when they do neuroimaging studies. And I'm bringing this up because a lot of people talk about the impact of cannabis on the brain. And what they do in these situations is they compare two groups. So they have one group that they call the no cannabis group and one group they call the cannabis group. And from this study, this is where they derive a lot of their information about whether or not cannabis has an impact on the brain. So the things that I would just like to point out, and I am doing this because I see a lot of people in the media and political opinions that are about whether or not cannabis should be legalized and what age it should be legalized at. People always seem to defer to brain science, and I find it ironic being a brain scientist. No one's ever asked me, is this, like, I study cannabinoids and I study the brain, so I find it interesting that people say these things and they just say, we trust brain scientists, and I'm like, it's interesting because I am a brain scientist and I haven't been asked these questions, and if you asked me, this is what I would say. And I would say, one, these studies are usually very poorly controlled. So when they do these brain scanning studies between the two populations, what you don't realize unless you really go into the methods of these papers is these are two fundamentally different populations of people. And this isn't just true for the brain scan studies. I'm sure a lot of you saw this one article about 3 or 4 years ago that got a lot of media attention saying that people who smoked pot as teenagers had lower IQ as adults. Raise your hand if you heard this in the media. I'm just curious. Okay, so how many of you heard that this was actually inaccurate afterwards? Because, okay, that's actually more than I thought. And so it was interesting because the original study that published this and said this, this is an example of how different these groups are. Their group that was the no cannabis group, about 70 to 80% of them after high school continued into college. And out of their cannabis smoking group, 0% continued after grade 12, and a large percentage didn't graduate high school, which makes it very difficult to interpret if this has anything to do with cannabis, because it likely has a lot of other life variables, socioeconomic status, ability to access resources in the environment, that likely are mediating those effects. And actually, 3 subsequent studies debunked that study by showing if you went back and controlled for education level, socioeconomic status, and other factors, there was no relationship between cannabis use as a teenager and IQ as an adult. And it's not surprising because IQ is a construct that is largely based on higher education. So if you don't go to college, your IQ will drop. Doesn't mean you're less intelligent, it just means you've been less exposed to the kind of information that is gauged in an IQ test. So it's very difficult in my mind to interpret these studies. And the same thing has happened with the brain scan studies where, one of them came out that said, there was this one that also got a lot of publicity saying there's these differences in a volume of a brain structure in people who smoke pot versus those who don't. And then they have at the bottom, if you try controlling for alcohol, like the ones that smoked cannabis also drank on a daily basis. And the other groups drank a bit, but not nearly as much. And if you controlled for alcohol, the effect was almost completely absent. But from a statistical perspective, there was a hair of significance. So they argued that this was a bona fide effect. And a lot of the scientific community was just kind of felt like you're really overselling what the data here is actually saying. And I think this is a major problem that has emerged in this field is people have taken things which are, in my mind, very poorly controlled studies and made grandiose conclusions about this. And the fact that people say that things are toxic to the brain, I find very problematic, both from the use of the word toxic, because that implies there's some degree of cell death, and that's never been discovered by anyone, that people who smoke pot have actually had cell death in the brain. The only thing that's ever been found is these slight differences in volume of a certain brain structure, but we have no idea if that was a pre-existing condition. And actually one twin study that looked at one twin that smoked pot and one that did not found that there was differences in brain structure even in the twin that didn't smoke pot, which would suggest that these actually may have been pre-existing differences in these populations, which makes it very hard to draw conclusions from this. So the other thing I want to point out is animal studies, and I do a lot of animal research, so I have to point out the problems with this because it's the other area that a lot of people draw on. So the thing that I have trouble with in the cannabinoid field for a lot of people who are doing these studies of adolescent administration, for example, is that what they're doing is injecting an unbelievable bolus of THC to an animal. So this isn't, they're not mimicking the pattern of administration. So most people do not inject a dose of THC into their gut. That's typically not how I've ever seen anyone consume cannabis. And there is a very big difference in the way that the body handles THC, whether it goes through a pulmonary route where it doesn't hit the liver and it basically goes straight to the brain versus if it goes through liver metabolism. And this is one of the reasons why when someone eats, say, a pot brownie, they have a very different high than if they smoke a joint, because of the fact that the way that the body metabolizes these molecules and creates byproducts that have differential effects is heavily influenced by this. And so if you give an animal an injection of THC that is approximating the dose someone would consume if, say, they smoked a quarter ounce in one go, like in a minute, it's an unbelievable amount of THC that's hitting the brain at once. This is very hard to understand how this is playing out in reality. And so there's been a huge push from a lot of the basic scientists like myself who argue with the people who do this way to say, you know, you can't do this in the cocaine field or the alcohol field. No one would accept this research anymore. You have to get animals to drink. You have to get them to self-administer cocaine because otherwise you're not mimicking natural patterns of activity. So taking data that's been developed like this and making broad conclusions off it, in my mind, is very dangerous. And I think it's very misleading. And so I think it's just something that people need to be aware of because none of this stuff ever gets discussed in a public venue about how people are interpreting this. You just see these flashy media headlines that say, this does this. So, yeah, and also the other problem is they almost always just study THC or one of these synthetic drugs, not even cannabis as a whole plant, and that makes a very big difference as well. So I'm running out of time now, so I'm just going to say the things that I think that need to be done, and thankfully they are being done from a research perspective, but I'm really hoping that now that the federal government has moved into this legalization position, that one of the things that they will do is move money from the tax revenue of cannabis into research, both basic, clinical, and public health, to understand the impacts at multiple levels on these things, because what we need to do is longitudinal studies. And what this is following someone, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the States has done this. They've initiated a program called the ABCD study where they're recruiting like 10,000 kids around the age of 10 and tracking them from IQ, intelligence, neuropsych functioning, and brain scanning from 10 on to 20 over a 10-year period. And what they want to do is understand if there are pre-existing differences, is there a trajectory that someone's going on? Or if someone is on a normal trajectory and they consume cannabis excessively, does that truly throw them off path? Because we don't really know this, and we've made a lot of supposition based on correlational data, and we need to understand this. And I've only seen one longitudinal study been done to date, and it was done in Hawaii. And in that study, they actually found no differences in brain structure or function when they actually followed the people before and after, and all the differences that they saw could be accounted for by pre-existing differences. And that's an important thing to know. And then with animal studies, that's a big thing about modeling route of administration. We need to start having animal studies that are having animals exposed to cannabis smoke or vapor in a manner that approximates THC and CBD levels with what humans consume. And I'm not saying that there's no risk for the developing brain because there is potential there. I think that's true of everything. That's not just true of cannabis. And I find it very weird that we have this debate about the age of cannabis and saying, oh, it should be 25 because it's bad, but alcohol can still be 18. And I'm like, to me, that gives an extremely mixed message because what it says, but if I was a teenager and I saw that, I would say, okay, so what you're telling me is I can binge drink all I want at 18 because my brain is fine, okay with that. But if I start smoking pot, I'm going to go down a bad path and I have to wait till I'm 25. And my argument would be, you know, obviously it would be best if everyone limited substance use as a teenager, period. I think realistically that's a very difficult prospect to manage, but I think we need to put things on an equal playing field and provide context when we have these discussions because it's very confusing to start cherry picking ages for different drugs when they're all going to have a detrimental effect when used excessively on a developing brain. There's no question about that. And also we need to study whole cannabis. So last thing I just want to say, should we be worried? Reefer madness, this is a big thing. I've developed a little bit of controversy in the field because I've been a very vocal advocate against the fact that I do not think there's any substantial evidence to directly link cannabis use to causing schizophrenia. I think if someone has the genetics or biology to become schizophrenic, cannabis use, especially at a young age, does seem to bring it out faster, so not a good thing. But to take someone who would never develop schizophrenia and have them smoke cannabis, I find there's no link, there's no evidence to suggest that someone would spontaneously do this. I think the most compelling bit for this would be to say, if you look at Canada, we have the highest rates of cannabis use in teenagers in the world, and you compare to Norway, which has the lowest, and our schizophrenia rates are exactly the same, essentially. And they've been stable pre and post the introduction of cannabis into the Western world. So it's very hard for me to understand how there's any causality link there, despite the fact that you do see these epidemiological associations. So there's something there, but not in a causal sense in my mind. And then the other thing is teenagers. And this is just a data slide from Colorado, which I think is important. And it is to show this misconception that a lot of people have about the fact that if cannabis gets legal, suddenly teenagers are going to go crazy and start smoking pot everywhere. And what they actually found in Colorado was a decline. This was quite surprising, but there was no upkick at all in cannabis use in teenagers pre and post legalization. And this was a shock to a lot of people in the United States, and this statistic seems to hold relatively true. So we don't know what it means, but I would say this is not something that we have to necessarily be concerned about. Suddenly from post to pre, that people are going to go crazy smoking cannabis. So I'll stop there, just so there's a couple of minutes for questions, if at all. And thank you. Sorry if I went too fast, and hopefully you're able to take something from that.